Hello and welcome to Marketing Speak. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today we have Neal Schaffer with us. Neal is an authority on helping innovative businesses through their digital transformation of sales and marketing through consulting, training, and development and execution of social media marketing strategy, influencer marketing, and social selling initiatives. He's also the author of The Age of Influence, which is published by HarperCollins Leadership, reinventing the way businesses look at digital influence and influencer marketing. He's also a podcaster and has the podcast Maximize Your Social Influence. Neal, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Stefan. I'm honored.
So, first of all, congratulations on The Age of Influence. Is this your first book?
It's actually my fourth book.
Fourth book, wow. So why don't your bios include all three other books and that this is your fourth and so forth? Like you're quite a storyteller.
I think that was the shortened version of my bio.
Right.
But yeah, my first three books were published back in 2009, 2011, and 2013. So there's a little bit of a gap. But yeah, normally would say the author of four books, including his latest, The Age of Influence. So I'll have to get on my website and revise my bio.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the fourth book. So what inspired you to write about this topic and why now?
Yeah, so, I am a marketing consultant like many that are probably listening to this podcast, and we're there to serve our community, our clients, our audience. And I do a lot of speaking and teaching, what have you. So I always look at what are the trends and sort of the questions that I get when I speak from clients, what have you. And I noticed 2 or 3 years ago that influencers and influencer marketing were questions that I was getting asked a lot. Now, if I turn the clock back to 2011, 2012, when I wrote my last book, which is called Maximize Your Social, that book was all about social media strategy creation, social media ROI measurement. And that's something that at the time the market really needed. Well, fast forward a few years, this whole phenomenon of influencers, it sparked me to start my own journey of delving a little bit deeper into what was happening in the industry. And when I, did some research and did some interviews with I realized that most marketers I believe, have really been misled about what influencer marketing really is and the potential it has for businesses. So like any other marketer, I test marketed a book idea and it sold. So I ended up writing the book. And the book was published in March of 2020, but working with a major publisher, obviously the content was written sometime before that. But I do believe that, as marketers, especially digital marketing, if you think about it, there's only a few limited options you have. You have your website or app, which is your digital, store. You have your SEO, pay-per-click. You have your email marketing, marketing automation. You have your blogging, content marketing. You have your social media marketing, which is more and more becoming paid. And then I believe the sixth sort of pillar of what you can be doing as a digital marketer is influencer marketing. In fact, without influencer marketing, I find just organically on social media, it's really hard to make any traction. And in fact, social media has become more of a paid media. So with that in mind, I think the trends are really pushing companies to delve deeper into influencer marketing. And hopefully once we start talking on this podcast, I think a lot of people are going to realize they've already probably been doing some of this. When you're working with an affiliate marketer, it's also a type of influencer marketing. You are tapping into someone that has digital influence. When you're a podcaster and you want to invite an influencer onto your podcast who's, more influential than you are, you're sort of tapping into that same concept of someone that has a bigger footprint. That person might share your podcast, but at a minimum, it's the credibility that you get by working with someone who's an influencer. So when you look at it that way, very holistically, you begin to see that influencer marketing isn't just about Instagram, and it's not just about people with 1 million followers. It's really about collaborating with other people in digital and social media for a variety of marketing objectives. And it's something that any business can and should tap into. So that's really, in a nutshell, what the book is about and the way I think that marketers should consider working with influencers.
Yeah, well, that's great. And getting onto other people's podcasts is a way of doing influencer marketing. You're doing this right now. How many podcasts have you been on to promote your book?
So I am on track to be on 100 different podcasts. I actually put this it's my own KPI. And the whole idea is that, and I'm going to bring up my spreadsheet right now. The whole idea is that my publisher, when I ask them, how should I approach book marketing today in 2020, should I do traditional media outreach? And they said, you really don't want to do that because it's going to cost you a lot of money and it's going to be ineffective. And I said, well, what do you recommend I do? And they said, we recommend you reach out to bloggers and podcasters. So bloggers are interesting. They're content creators, they're influencers, but there aren't that many blogs that focus on interviewing people, right? Blogs are usually, written about a topic. There's very few interviews, very few book reviews. But when you get to podcasts, most podcasts are based on an interview format. So that's why, to me, it made sense to strategically focus on that. And I said, you know what? If I'm going to leave no stone unturned, how many podcasts do I want to go on to say that I've made an impact? So I came up with the number 100. That's going to be my KPI. I'm not going to stop until I'm on 100, obviously qualified and relevant podcasts. So just looking today, I've already been on 80 that have been published. And including this podcast, there's another 26 that are either we've already recorded or are scheduled to be recorded. So I'm on track to be on 100 podcasts. It's taken a few months, but it's been a great experience. One podcast I was on, after the interview, the gentleman said, I'd like to hire you for your consulting. So I got at least one client that I wasn't expecting out of the exercise. But yeah, I've had people come up to me, Neal, I heard you on so-and-so's podcast. I went out and bought your book. And I think a lot of people, obviously as podcasters, we understand this, but marketers that don't have their own podcast really sometimes don't understand the potential that podcasts have to yield influence in digital marketing as well.
Yeah, for sure. And how did you compile that list of 100 podcasts? How did I end up on that list? Like, did you delegate that to a VA, or did you do a lot of that work yourself?
I have this really bad habit. It's like a drug, but some of the stuff that's really close to my brand, I feel I need to do myself, that I can't rely on others. So this is research that I did myself. And I used a website called Chartable. If you are even if you're not a podcaster, if someone reaches out to you, says, we'd love for you to be on our podcast, you can go to chartable.com and you can look up that podcast. It'll show you if it's in the top rankings on Apple Podcasts in any country for any category. So I literally went into Chartable. I said, okay, for my podcast, my 4 big markets are US, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, probably the same for most English-speaking podcasters. So I went into Chartable and I went into the top 250 podcasts in marketing for each one of those 4 countries. And I did that. Man, I had to refresh the data sometimes. So the charts, they obviously update every day. But I just solely went through that list of it ended up being 1,000 different podcasts, looking for ones that were relevant, looking for ones that were still publishing, because many, they were on the charts but they weren't publishing anymore, looking for ones that had a weekly cadence, looking for ones that interview people, and from there I started the outreach. So it was a process, but I have people reaching out to me, published authors, but their subject's irrelevant. I kind of said, did you go through that homework? Did you do your research? And it's very similar to influencer outreach. If you reach out to the wrong people, you don't get responses. It looks automated. It doesn't look personal. And I've had many people say, Neal, I invited you on the podcast because I thought your outreach is very personal. We get tons of these every day. Yours really stood out as being someone who did their homework. So I think, it just goes to show for influencer marketing, if you want to, it's based on relationships, right? And if you want to create those relationships, you need to really start by doing your homework and making sure you're reaching out to the right people.
Yeah. And I have to say that out of all the pitches that I get, yours stood out. I rarely take pitches. I have a list, my Google sheet of potential guests that I'm targeting has at least 300 people on it. And
oh, wow.
So you made it through the I don't know, the gatekeepers and all that, all the way to me, and I approved it because you had a compelling and personalized email, and it stood apart from all of the ones I normally get from Interview Valet and all those sorts of companies.
Oh, I get those too. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think it's just, at the heart, I believe I'm an educator. I think most consultants are educators. And, this passion I want to serve the community, and I really want to share the message. I'm not trying to sell anything other than a $20 book. So I think a lot of people are just very aggressive. They want to pitch something because they have a product, they have a course. I don't know. And they're just very aggressive in their tactics. And there's usually a lack of relevancy. And I think, I'm speaking with a gentleman right now, and this just goes to show you when you are an influencer, you only want to bring on relevant people. This is someone who is actually a best-selling book author, but the subject is just not directly related to the topic of my podcast, right? So it's something where I genuinely want to help this person because I think he writes great content. But if it's not relevant for my podcast, my listeners are going to go, why is this person on this podcast? What's the connection? Because we make a promise in our description that we're going to provide content around this subject. And when we veer from that, we begin to lose our influence. People begin to unsubscribe and what have you. So, a lot of people say, well, when working with influencers, they post ads from, all sorts of companies. And I think the best ones really don't. And the ones that do, it's pretty easy to see that they're just in it for the money and they don't really have a genuine following. Yep. So, these are, we're really going through a lot of points I talk about in my book, using podcasting as an example, but it really is, there's only 4 ways of creating digital content, right? There's textual, which is a blog. There's video, which is YouTube. There's, photographs, which we think of Instagram, but really any social media. Pinterest too. And then we have audio, which is podcasts. Yeah. So when you're working with a content creator in any one of those fields, you want to do your best to develop that relationship, knowing that they're getting pitched by, hundreds of people on a regular basis.
Yeah. And do you have advertising on your podcast?
I don't do advertising on my podcast, and I've never had a sponsored podcast per se. I have done sponsored blog posts where I felt, the company, I knew them, what they wanted to talk about was educational and it would serve my audience. And obviously at the very bottom, I talk about that it was a sponsored post, but the opinions were 100% mine. I haven't gotten the podcast route, Stefan, but it's really interesting because one gentleman I reached out to, I had one person try to sell me. Hey, you'll for $750, look at my stats on downloads. And I'm thinking I'm getting the same amount of downloads. I'm not charging people. But there were another gentleman was saying, I'm going to start, I have so many requests, I have to start charging if you want to be on my podcast. So I just obviously crossed those 2 off the list. And on the flip side, I know there's the interview valets, what have you, you pay money and they'll get you interviews. And I understand it saves time, but still, I think you're going to have the best chance of success if you listen to podcasts and you understand the podcast and you reach out. And yeah, it's pretty magical. I mean, I only listen to 10 podcasts at a time, and I was recently featured on one of those 10 podcasts. So that was pretty amazing to hear myself on a podcast I normally listen to. So I wonder if the people that reach out to me really listen to podcasts, because I get the feeling that some of them don't, and therefore they don't understand the whole paradigm.
Well, that's funny that I think a lot of the email pitches I get, they've never listened to my podcast. And what really irks me is that this disingenuous kind of comment or I don't know, they're trying to ingratiate or something. They're saying that I have a great podcast and something about the latest episode or whatever. And I just know that they did not listen to my show and that they're not listeners. They're just doing this with everybody. And that just really irks me. I hear you. I don't like liars. And so those automatically go into the trash.
Yeah. I hear you. So, if you are a marketer and you're saying, we want to start to collaborate with more content creators, we want to be talked about on more blogs, be interviewed on podcasts, show up in YouTube videos. That's really the first step is doing, we call this influencer identification, is really doing your homework, which is why the VA or even any tool, just natively go in. I tell businesses, just start by natively going to YouTube and doing searches for the subject that you would want to appear in a video for. Who shows up, right? Go on to Instagram, go on to Apple Podcasts. You can do searches as well. And, not only once you identify these influencers, but then would it make sense if you appeared on their show? Like, for instance, there's a number of marketing podcasts that just focus on female entrepreneurs, and everyone they interview is a female. So it would be really weird if I reached out to them, asking to be interviewed when I know that their whole mission is to serve females and they only have females to interview. That just as an example, right?
Yeah. But like then Biz Chicks. That's exactly. A great podcast, and yeah, you won't get on that one.
I listen to some of those as well. They're awesome, and then it's that outreach, and there's many ways to do it, but You just got to be human. You got to be yourself. You got to put yourself in their shoes. Yeah, I mean, with podcasts, it's a little bit different, but with social media, there's a lot of social signals you can send in advance to really, build a relationship even before that outreach if you want to increase your chances.
Right. So you're talking about doing things like commenting on their Instagram or on their tweeting and commenting on their tweets and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, in an authentic way, right?
Yeah.
The easiest thing to do, and when you mention Twitter, if you're in marketing, you're probably doing some sort of content curation. So if you're going to curate content, why wouldn't you want to curate it from the influencers that you want to collaborate with? That's really a first step at influencer marketing. It's very strategic content curation.
Yeah. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm curious, do you use SparkToro to try and build a list of podcasts to target? I know you use Chartable, but it seems like it would be super easy to just put in some keywords, marketing as an example, or social media marketing into the tool and get a whole bunch of podcasts, YouTube channels, websites, and social accounts that the audience of people who are or the community of people who are talking about that keyword, social media marketing, are subscribing to and listening to and so forth. Are you familiar with that tool, first of all?
I am. I interviewed someone from Moz on my podcast, and at the end, he's like, "You should really check out SparkToro. I'll introduce you to Rand." And of course, Rand Fishkin is an absolute legend.
Yeah.
So I do have access to the tool. I have yet to start using it, and I do know that one of the compelling use cases is, for finding podcasters. My approach was, use publicly available information and focus on the charts, meaning that there are a lot of people who do podcasting but never show up in those charts. Yeah. So I met one gentleman who wanted to be on my podcast. He does a tremendous amount of content publication, but when I did, backlink analysis or domain authority analysis on SEMrush, or I went into Chartable, he just showed up nowhere. So, if I'm going to invest a little bit of my time, I want to make sure it has impact. And therefore, if someone is appearing on the charts and my podcast, appears on various charts as well, I can sort of guess as to what impact they have in terms of downloads. So that was my approach, right? The SparkToro is definitely a great tool that I look, and Rand is on my waiting list to interview on my podcast as well. So I'm looking to delve deeper into that. But I've heard a lot of podcasters talk about it in a similar way. So if you're listening, that is a tool I'd recommend checking out.
Yeah. I love the tool. It took a couple weeks for me actually a couple months before I started using the tool, but I've been hooked ever since. It's amazing, and it's really quite straightforward and easy to use. So I highly recommend it. Rand, by the way, is my co-author on the first 2 editions of The Art of SEO. So I've known Rand for many, many years.
That's so the art of it. There's a few authors. Isn't Eric Ainge one of the authors of that as well?
Eric Enga.
Another book?
Yep.
Eric Enga. Yeah. Great guy.
Yeah, he is. I recruited him to help out with the book in the SCS Chicago Speaker Lounge in 2009.
Hold on 1 second here. Had to bring it out.
Oh, there we go. That's awesome. Yeah. So Rand was a co-author on the first 2 editions, but he's been too busy. So yeah, great guy.
Yeah, and so I never was in the world of SEO, but back in the day, my blog right now is nealschaffer.com. It used to be called maximizesocialbusiness.com. And one day a gentleman named Mark Traphagen said, "I'd love to contribute about Google+." And through Mark, and obviously he went to Stone Temple.
Right.
And when they did their mobile marketing conference, they invited me out to speak, and I got to know Eric, and just great people.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I was just curious. I was going to ask you. I know it's your podcast, but what is the use case scenario for you using SparkToro? Because I think until SparkToro, a lot of marketers were using a tool like BuzzSumo, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I know that SparkToro is different, but I'm just curious as to what are the use case scenarios for how you use it?
Yeah, so BuzzSumo is more for seeing which particular headlines or articles are really getting traction, maybe get some ideas for I don't know, like a link bait or clickbait type of blog post. Although I find it's equally effective to just do a /BuzzFeed.com plus whatever keyword search and finding it that way. And the Viral Nova, Distractify, Upworthy, Board Panda, all those sorts of viral sites have a really good team that knows how to create headlines that are like really hooky. Now, I use SparkToro and my clients, I use it on behalf of my clients too, so that we can identify podcasts, social accounts, and YouTube channels, and actually websites as well that are either relevant to their audience, or it's maybe journalists that we're trying to reach, or bloggers and influencers in that topic space. It's just incredible. And in fact, I've had clients say, I had no idea that this direct competitor even existed until we did this research, or I didn't know how overlapping these big social media influencers were, like Casey Neistat. The audience of Casey Neistat's and one of my clients is, I don't know, like 30%. It's quite an overlap, and so maybe there's some collab opportunities there that we just never thought of until we started using the tool. So that's my experience.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely, it's taken me a few months, so I'm on par to be where you are. But I keep getting the emails, and obviously Rand continues to build up that tool, so I'm gonna have to dig into it one of these days.
Yeah, and it also shows you the hashtags that audience are using, so you can say, oh, you know what, I'm not even using the right hashtags in all my Instagram posts. I should be using these instead, because that's what my audience is using. And I don't know of any other tool that gives you that insight.
That's really good data, yeah.
Yeah. If I ever do an update to my social e-commerce book, I'm definitely going to dedicate some amount of it to SparkToro. That's that cool of a tool.
Yeah, and I have a chapter in my book on influencer marketing tools, and I went as far as including a BuzzSumo as because BuzzSumo does give you the ability to see, who are the sharers of content, number of backlinks that each piece of content generates. It even has a little influencer section. But yeah, it was before I knew about SparkToro. It was, a year and a half ago, and SparkToro is relatively new. So that'll definitely make my next edition as well.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I'm really curious what your objectives are for getting on each of these different podcasts, because what I've found is that each podcast host has a different kind of sphere of influence, a different network of people, and they're just, the opportunities are very specific. Like one of my past guests, so this wasn't on his show, this was him being on my show. He was a very big deal in the e-tail space, in the online retail space, former CEO of a big company, and I had no intention of having him become a referral source, but over the course of 2 months, he referred 3 different portfolio companies to me, which is
wow,
pretty awesome. And so what I've found, I got this, I don't know, this little bit of wisdom from Ephraim Olszewski that really stuck with me, and that's, if you have a more powerful intention, you'll have a more powerful outcome. So I specifically, for each podcast interview opportunity, whether I'm going to be on somebody's show or they're going to be on mine, I always think through, how am I going to show up more powerfully and get with a more powerful intention and get a more powerful outcome for not just myself, but for my listeners or the people who are listening to that particular episode of that person's show, or maybe business relationships, or I don't know, some sort of opportunity. And plus, I always think about, how can I reveal light? Even if it's just a geeky marketing episode, I always think about, how can I reveal light through this podcast? And it really helps. It really does.
Yeah, I think that, for me, I talk about in terms of influencer marketing, when we look at organic social media marketing, that organic reach is dead or dying for businesses. It's really the concept that, social media is we think, what are people doing today, after coronavirus, with the digital first consumer? It's search, social, or email, right? So that search, the email, I think we have a lot more control over. The social, we really don't. We're at the mercy of algorithms. And unfortunately, paid media on Facebook, what have you, they are ads. It's very hard for an ad to go viral, although it does sometimes happen. So, I talk about the need to incite word of mouth. If people are not talking about you on social, you need to get them talking about you. It's the only way to sort of gain traction. And that's the core of this concept of influencer marketing that I talk about. So for me, it was inciting word of mouth in the world of marketing podcasts. And by doing my research, I knew that each one of these podcasts probably, there's no public number of how many downloads podcasts get, but I knew that 100, that I would be reaching a very, very targeted yet large audience by being on these various podcasts. Now, I will say that there are still very few podcasts. So I think the number of blogs that exist in the world are like 700 million. I think the number of YouTube channels or active YouTube channels are maybe 60, 70 million. The number of active podcasts is still only at 1 million, right? Which means there's lots of opportunities for businesses indeed. But on the other hand, when you're looking for a lot of places to be interviewed, it gets more and more niche. Yeah. So even within marketing, I found myself being interviewed on, for instance, a school marketing podcast, or a podcast that just focuses on e-commerce, a podcast that just focuses on retail. And I really love that challenge because I really think holistically about business. And even though I'm not an e-commerce expert, I'm not a retail expert, I'm not a school marketing expert, that I have enough experience working with different industries that I believe that there is something that they can take away from my book. So that was a really, really good educational experience for me because I was asked to apply all of these things that I learned in these different markets. And because I'm probably like yourself, I'm not industry specific in the clients that I work with. I work with B2B, B2C across various industries. I really enjoy that challenge. And it's this passion to serve. And I believe that through sharing what I've learned, I'm serving and hopefully helping businesses, be more effective with their marketing. So I do believe, like anything else, if you are a content creator, like we're podcasters, you have to be passionate about what you do. If you don't have that passion, that's when you stop after 5 episodes. I took a few years off my own podcast because I, in all honesty, was not a consumer of podcasts. I was doing podcasting as part of content marketing without being an active listener, an active consumer. And once I started becoming an active consumer, about a year ago, actually, Q4 of last year, that's where I really realized that I've been doing podcasting all wrong. So getting back to those people that reach out but never listen to podcasts, or, you want to appear on a YouTube channel, but you've never created your own YouTube channel. You don't know what goes into that. And, when they have, 1,000 subscribers or 10,000 subscribers, how long it took them to get that way. I think you miss out on the value and you don't show up as strategically as you could. So, I agree with you. Everything you do must be for intent. For me, it is that intent of inciting word of mouth, of getting people talking about it, my book. And even if it's just one content creator, interviewing me, at least I know it's going out to a certain number of people. There's a guarantee of that. Yeah. And as we know, podcasting, how much do people spend when they're on your site reading a blog post? A few minutes. How long do they spend watching your YouTube video? I don't know many that go past 10 minutes. It depends on the content. But with a podcast, people are locked in, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour. And the average person listens to the podcast. The average podcast listener listens to about 6 or 7 hours a week, they say. So that is that's probably more dedicated time for content creators than in any other content medium, right? Even on Instagram, it's a story, it's 15 seconds. So yeah. So that's why that's why for me, I thought to incite that word of mouth, it would be the most compelling medium.
Yeah, and it's the most intimate, right? So they're just listening in their ears to you for 30, 40, whatever minutes, and you have the opportunity to tell amazing stories, to enroll them, to galvanize them and inspire them. It's kind of magical.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mentioned there's only 1 million podcasts, so there's so much opportunity. So one of my clients is one of the top real estate companies in the country. And I've actually been, as part of this 100 podcasts, some of them were real estate marketing podcasts because what I talk about is really relevant for agents and for brokers and for companies. So, I'm talking to the CEO and when I did a competitive audit of all the major real estate companies, there was only one that had a podcast, and they had only been doing it for a month. Or I should say they've only been doing it monthly for a few months. So they weren't really active. I consider weekly, an active podcast. And I looked around, and there were a few really, really popular, real estate marketing podcasts that were done by agents, brokers, former agents, brokers who had their own programs, or they do consulting. They're great people, don't get me wrong. But I told the CEO, I said, look, this is really an opportunity. And in fact, you can really celebrate, your own successful agents as part of the because what these podcasts do is they celebrate the success of other agents, right? They bring them in to give advice to all the listeners. So I said, you really have a chance here, to put all the resources behind this podcast and really, really, stand out as becoming the number one podcast in this industry. And I think that this is the same for most industries right now with podcasting. And I always say, any business could become an influencer on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, but businesses just don't have that DNA, right? They want to talk more about their product than about the solutions that people are looking for, the needs of people, what have you. But if they, they have the resources, they have the video studios, they definitely have the money to invest in advertising, what have you. So once they have that content creator mindset of really serving a community, whether or not they're selling their product, I think that any business can have a very, very successful podcast and really have a lot of impact with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm curious, like if you were to quantify the most meaningful metrics about word of mouth and how things kind of go viral or not. There's shares, there are comments, there's likes, and all the other reactions. There are a few different things that you could measure. What really stands out as the most important?
Are you talking specifically to being guesting on podcasts?
No, I'm specific. Like if you're talking to people on podcasts and you're inspiring those listeners to create kind of a movement around what you're saying, and they turn out in droves on social media. They don't all have podcasts to share the message, but they all have social accounts. How do you measure your follow-on impact from these podcast guest appearances?
Yeah, so obviously this is something that's very, very hard to measure the tangibles, or to measure the intangibles is even harder, obviously. So, it comes down to a few things. I mean, I will go to companies and I ask them, how do you measure the ROI of your website? And some will say, hey, our CEO still asks us whenever we want to do a website improvement that we have to calculate the ROI. So I know that for some, companies, some aspects, there's a need to measure more than others. I'm a small business owner. For me, it's really the main KPI was actually being published on 100 top marketing podcasts. Beyond that, obviously, it gets a little bit anecdotal, but I know that, estimating the number of downloads that each one of these has, knowing that, for some of them, backlinks were actually created. I actually had an SEO expert reach out to me saying, hey, you want to learn about my latest, technique? I generated, 90 backlinks and it didn't cost anything. And I said, I bet you went on to podcast, didn't you? And he goes, how'd you know? So I don't do these interviews.
Blinding flash of the obvious, right?
Exactly. That's not my intention, right? And I hope that nobody's thinking of doing it for that intention, but it is a byproduct, a natural byproduct of what happens. And if you ever do a competitive backlink analysis for a website that does have a podcast, you begin to see that pattern as well. But that's obviously something else. It's when they share it in social media and everyone that engages with that content in social media, it's obviously, that's another part of inciting that word of mouth. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to two things. It comes down to actual sales. Is the book selling more and more because of that? And I look at people that do a search for my domain. They don't search on Google. They go straight to nealschaffer.com. And that to me is the ultimate in brand awareness, when more and more people come directly to my website. So that is also a number that I look at, and I do this with my clients as well. When more and more people are talking about you and you become more famous, you should have more of that direct traffic coming to you. So those are the main things I look at. I don't get, there are other KPIs I have for the book marketing, like, number of reviews. Obviously, the book sales themselves are really important. Number of people that download the preview edition of my book as part of the lead magnet when people come to my website. So there's a few different things. And at the end of the day, Stephan, a book, as you know, well, you might have made a lot of money off this book, but in general, in general,
I did
you're
build
not
some
gonna.
muscle by carrying it around because I bring boxes of it to give away when I would keynote at conferences and stuff. And it's a what is it? Well, 1,000 pages. I can't remember how much weight it is. I think it might be 5 pounds or something. But
Oh yeah, it's heavy, and yeah, the third edition has 950 pages. So, yeah, so you do not become you cannot drive a business from book sales, but the book itself becomes the ultimate business card. It becomes the ultimate way to promote your business, to promote yourself.
right,
So that's where, at the end of the day, this is only part of the whole picture. I've gotten more business. I'm actually am busier now than my company has ever been. So, and most of this business came after coronavirus, after the publication of the book. So I know that that really is the ultimate, is my business going up as a result of this. And what are the attributes? What caused it to go up? Some of it is very, anecdotal. That real estate company president, the CEO, he happened to buy my book. He bought it. He read it. He goes, "We need to do this here." And it just so happened that someone in the executive board is someone that I know from social media that reached out to me and said, "Hey, my CEO is talking about you." So, a lot of this is, business often is, who do you know, right? What relationship can you create with them? Are you being found? So it really sort of comes back to those fundamentals. You could say the fundamentals of search engine optimization as well is that, are you out there? And Amazon is another search engine where people who want to read books will go to. Do you appear there? Do you appear in podcasts? Do you appear in social media? Do you appear on YouTube? So it's all part of a grand scheme that, we can only measure so much. And when we have limited marketing budgets, we need to be very careful with that. But, I think, Stephan, at some point, it sort of becomes part of an infrastructure, a marketing infrastructure. Like, you have a website. You need to be doing, even if organic social media reach is dead, as a reputable company, you still need to do it, right? You need to show that you're present. You need to be adding value the best you can, regardless of the algorithm, because you still have your fans that will engage with you. So to me, it's all part of this, this infrastructure of a modern digital marketing infrastructure. And I would say, every month guesting on a podcast, every month adding a guest blog to your domain blogs. I think part of that natural showing up on other relevant sites through content, whether it's podcast or YouTube or blog, I think that's another natural component today if you really want to be heard by more people, found by more people.
yeah. Well, one metric that I've added to my list when I first heard about it made so much sense, and it's a social metric. It's actually part of Facebook's algorithm, and if you're advertising, you want to maximize this metric so that you get the best return on ad spend, and that is share to reaction ratio. Once I heard it, it just made all the sense in the world. If you have way more shares than you have reactions, like likes, loves, wows, and all that, people just they're trying to inspire lots of comments, like say this in the comments, and I'll give you this cool thing or whatever. That's not where the magic happens. If you get lots of shares of your ad or your organic post, that if you're posting as a page on Facebook, you're not going to get much traction if you're not paying. But if you're posting from your personal profile and you have a lot of friends and engagement, and you get a high share to reaction ratio, that could really spread. So that's something I've been paying attention to lately.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I listen to a lot of Instagram marketing podcasts. It's always the one network that there's still opportunity for organic engagement there, right? And definitely, it's not necessarily a share, but when people save your post to their collection, or when people share, there's not a lot of reposting. I mean, Twitter at the beginning didn't have a retweet function either. Maybe Instagram will add a repost, but people that will share your post to their story. I mean, these are signals, and I believe those are probably the most powerful signal for any algorithm, is when someone wants to represent your content on their platform. And I do agree with you. I don't necessarily look at the share / reaction ratio. I just look at aggregate shares. And one of the outcomes of this competitive analysis I did for this real estate company was, I was comparing how we were doing, how our Facebook page was doing, and we got the best engagement because we were doing a lot of videos. And if you count video views as engagement, this is up for debate, but I did. It showed that they by far had the best. But the best companies had the most aggregate shares. So I said, look, instead of looking at social media as a way of promotion, look at it as a way of collaboration. Create content that others would want to share. Create content that your agents would want to share. If they're looking for content creation, let them go to your page. And obviously, there were two real estate companies in particular that were already doing this. You could see by the numbers. And I said, look, if we only had 10% of our agents share one post, we would, be 2.5 times higher than the number one, company here. And you can imagine how that incites word of mouth. So I believe that shareability in terms of the content that you publish, but also just the mindset of collaboration. In this case, it's more of like an employee advocacy type of concept. But if you're a big company listening to this, I think that's huge. And, I consider when I look at, influencers in my book, I talk about the way that the influencer marketing industry defines influencers, which is based on Instagram followers. And I am not from this industry, as you can tell. But they even define a nano influencer as someone that has 1,000 followers. So I start there and say, doesn't this model make more sense? And it's the like, know, and trust model. It's the brand affinity model. Who that already knows, likes, and trusts your brand, has 1,000 followers. So look at your followers in social media. Look at your customers. Look at your partners. Look at your employees. And you're going to find a lot of influencers that lurk among them that you can activate when you have the right program in place, when you have the right conversations, right? And I think this is a huge opportunity. I think the whole employee advocacy, movement was about, well, we'll publish great content. Why aren't you sharing it? Where it really should be this collaborative mindset. And I think the power of just sourcing content from people that already are talking about your brand alone is huge, especially when we talk about visual content, right? Like Instagram. So employee influencers, that's another, and brand advocacy of leveraging your customers. And I think more and more brands are getting smarter. Instead of reaching out to people that don't know them, it ends up being more one-time transactional. If you work with people that have already used your product, it's going to sound a heck of a lot more authentic and real and more engaging at the end set of it.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said about seeing this as an opportunity to collaborate. And it's not just getting people to share your content, it's maybe even getting them to collaborate on the creation of the content. Like Brian Dean has this strategy that he put out there years ago called Guestographics. It's an infographic that's kind of partway done, and you reach out to the influencer and you pitch them in a way that it sounds like you need their help to complete the infographic because you're looking to them as that subject matter expert or that person who has special data or insights or research or whatever that would help complete that infographic, and then they kind of take some intellectual and emotional ownership of it once it's complete because you've given them credit and the sources part of the infographic, et cetera, and they're more inclined to share it and post it to their blog.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been doing a lot of research most recently about the blogger as influencer. And I think it's something that's, this is probably the most mature industry where people do outreach. They do outreach to bloggers and they use these automated tools. It's templates. They do these automatic reminders. And I think we all hate receiving them, right? But when I do backlink analysis on my competitors, I find that there are people that come up that are just naturally it's seemingly naturally inserting links back to this blog at every opportunity they have. So I've come to the conclusion that a lot of it does come down to relationships with influencers in the blogosphere, that there are probably in any given industry, there are writers that they do this for a living, but they can heavily influence the generation of backlinks. Obviously, you yourself, guest blogging is the ultimate, but it's just like when I reached out to podcasters, letting them know that I have my own podcast as well, and I open it up. I've had a lot of people say, "Hey, Neal, can I be on your podcast?" And obviously, if they're going to guest me, I'd want them to be on my podcast as well. So I think really thinking strategically about relationships with writers and blog owners, and in a lot of different ways. Obviously, this goes beyond what Google likes or dislikes. But at the end of the day, I have naturally linked back to people that are friends. I'd link back to Mark Trappake, and he's blogged for me before, right? Stone Temple Consulting, what have you. So I think that it's also human nature. And I think it was Andy Crestodino who said, look, like 70% of links there is some reciprocity, because we naturally link to some blog sites, and some blog sites will naturally link to you. So I believe that there's a lot of area for collaboration, not just with Instagrammers, YouTubers, or podcasters, but with writers. And therefore, when I see people reach out to me saying, I've written for, this, and this site, I usually ask them, what are they an expert in? They can't respond because they're not an expert in anything. They're an expert writer. They're an expert researcher, and they're good at what they do. But some of those people actually are quite influential. And I'm now looking at those pitches I get from some of these people in a very, very different way. I don't know, Stephan, what you think about that, but.
Well, I think that everybody has a unique ability. We just don't necessarily know from reading their bio what it is. And if somebody's going to add value on my podcast, I want to give them that opportunity. And one thing that I think is one thing that made me curious was you said you found out after listening to a bunch of podcasts that you were doing podcasting all wrong. So this seems like a good segue to get back to that, because
sure,
I think that's related. Maybe I'm wrong, but you tell me. Oh, and by the way, one other thing, that when you were saying that a lot of these links are reciprocal, and Andy Crestodine he's a super smart guy. I've had him on the podcast, and I rate him highly. So what happens is that you'll get some people who are so fixated on not creating reciprocal links because they think it's bad for SEO, they won't even put a press piece that is really impressive on their press page, because now it becomes a reciprocal link, because that article linked to you, and then now you're linking back to it, and doesn't that negate the value of it? And that just is very short-sighted, and I think a big mistake. Like, you want to create a press page that really impresses people and has lots of social proof, and so every single column that I write, every single piece of news that quotes me or features me, I want to include that on my press page or my media page. It's, I think, a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that, and I see this with social media as well, some marketers get lost in the weeds. And sometimes you got to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. I mean, I'm an SEO newbie. You're the expert at this, but I think the search engines are a lot smarter, and they do look at a lot of details, but they're also looking at the big picture, right?
Yeah, and they're getting like super smart with AI. AI will become smarter than us if we don't augment our brains with technology. So it's only a matter of time before the AIs at Google will be able to detect relevancy and authority and trustworthiness and all that in a way that far exceeds human ability, and isn't just based on a rudimentary algorithm, but is really kind of artificial general intelligence. So that day is coming. So back to go ahead.
And if you're creating great content, that should be all the more beneficial for you.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see. But let's get back to this topic of doing podcasting all wrong, because I'm curious what you found from listening to all the, like, being a consumer of podcasts. What were your epiphanies as far as you being a host?
Well, obviously you begin to realize that there are patterns, right? So I had someone, reach out to me or someone that got introduced to me that basically set everything up for me. And it was sort of rigid. They also did voiceover, so I was able to change intros and outros, but I didn't realize that, the intro really delivers the promise as to what this podcast is about. And if I listen to that intro and it's not relevant to me, I'm not going to keep listening. That's for one, right? Obviously, there are people that do solo. There are people that do interviews. But what you say has to answer that mission that you talk about in your intro. of why you're doing this podcast. And it's funny because I find even in marketing, I find some podcasters, they say they're all about talking about marketing, and yet they talk about, self-love or networking or entrepreneurship that aren't really directly related to marketing. And I will unsubscribe from those podcasts because there's only so many podcasts we can subscribe to. And especially with coronavirus, I'm driving less, and I used to listen to more podcasts driving. So that's sort of another thing. Another one was, banter on interviews that really wasn't serving the audience, personal conversations, or sometimes podcasts. I understand you want to be relatable, you want to be a little bit personal, and I will sometimes start my podcast out that way as well. But then I'll switch, after the 1 or 2 minute thing, we switch back into, why are people listening to this? I'm here to serve them information and advice. So also things like, asking for people to subscribe, asking for reviews, and the creative ways in which podcasters ask for reviews, the creative ways in which one particular podcast, and I told her this, a Content 10X, Amy Woods, it's all about content repurposing. It's a great podcast. And she began to use a teaser before the intro. So are you still trying to figure out how to make the most mileage out of your podcast? Listen to this next episode where we're going to introduce you 26 different ways to repurpose your podcast. And then it goes into the intro, right? And I thought that was really brilliant. And I've actually started to do that with my own podcast of having like a 10 or 15 second teaser before the intro to get people to stay tuned in. So it's just a lot of things. It was when I started doing it again, I was doing live stream interviews and using that for my podcast. And my editor came back to me and said, Neal, you mentioned all these comments that are appearing on screen, but from the podcast listener, it's completely irrelevant. They get lost. I said, you're right. Let's edit all those out. So I realized that I need to do podcasting for my podcast listeners. A live stream is not serving my podcast listeners. Yeah. And I absolutely stopped doing that. I also noticed everyone's like, podcasting is great for SEO. Well, is it really good for SEO? Because when I repurpose my show notes in the blog posts, they perform worse than because my normal blog posts, I'm blogging with an intention. A podcast is an intention for the listener. So I don't repurpose this stuff. I finally created a podcast page on my website. And what I do is I have the most recent 25 podcasts, and then beyond that, my most popular 25 podcasts. And I'm at about episode 179 as we speak. And I will update that on a weekly basis to keep it fresh. And that's where I drive people from social media. But I don't believe in repurposing. I have repurposed some podcasts, but it's almost like a blog post. The podcast was the inspiration for the blog post. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So just a lot of little things that I've learned that I think, and one of the things is obviously being on other podcasts. I forgot to mention another KPI is my own podcast growing, because they say one of the best things you can do to grow your podcast is to go on other podcasts, and people find out about you, and if they like you, they might subscribe to your podcast, right? So that's another number that I look at. But it's all these things, and really being intentional with an editorial calendar for a podcast, like I might have for a blog. These are the things I want to cover. Now I'm going through and saying, wow, I haven't covered podcasting in a while. So, I want to create an episode for that or what have you. So it's like everything else in marketing. It's really having intention, but you really need to, and it's like any other social network. If you want to do better at Instagram, find a role model. If you want to write a better blog, find a role model. And it's the same concept. Find role models that are podcasters that will teach you the way or the things you should be thinking about when you have your own podcast. It was just a whole slew of things, right? It's also obviously keeping to that regular schedule of showing up on a regular basis. I know there's certain podcasts that I look forward to on a regular basis. And when they don't show up, I sort of forget about them because I listen to the other podcasts that show up. So there's just a number of things that I learned through that process. And it's really made me approach podcasting very differently and way more strategically than I did in the past.
Yeah, that's all great advice. And one thing that I learned from Tom Hazard maybe 2 years ago was to turn my show notes pages into long-form blog posts by basing it on the transcript and then adding images from Unsplash, Pexels.com, etc., and click to tweets and so forth to break up the text, because nobody wants to read just a wall of text kind of transcript. But if it reads like a blog post, it looks like a blog post, may not have been written from scratch as a blog post. It is pretty much still the transcript cleaned up. But still, ever since I switched to that, I saw my search results improving and search traffic. I got anecdotal feedback from people who, like, one of my friends is a literal billionaire, and she won't listen to my podcast. Either one. She won't listen to either show. But she is really enjoying the show notes pages now. So she does go through them.
That's really interesting.
So I think in fact, I had my team, like, we developed a core competency, and we're even doing this for one of our clients now, creating these long form blog posts for their podcast. But what we did first after switching was, let's go back through the back catalog, and hundreds of past episodes for my two shows and for my wife's show, Stellar Life podcast. We cranked through all of those and turned them into the long form blog posts. I highly recommend it, so you might want to consider
that.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
So we better switch to lightning round because we only have a couple minutes left, and I do want to get at least 3 more quick questions in if we can manage it.
Let's do it.
Okay. So what are some quantitative metrics to measure the impact or influence of an influencer?
Ooh. Obviously, one of the things we look at is what is their reach. And not only on that social network, but on other networks. Mm-hmm. When they publish a post, what sort of reach does it have? We then look at the impact of that reach. Obviously, if they have a website, we can look at, we look at the whole backlinks, who's linking to them, what sort of influence they have that way. So there's a lot of different. I think some of it is also comparative, because you're probably not just looking at one person, you're looking at 10 people, 20 people. Companies will sometimes create pools of 1,000, 2,000 influencers using tools to really compare and contrast them. But obviously, at the end of the day, Stephan, what it comes down to is actually engaging with them and doing some sort of a campaign and getting data from that. Because without that, you never know the influence that they might have for your own particular product or service. Mm-hmm. And therefore, once you get that, it's almost like, well, Neal, what's the ROI of a Facebook ad? I don't know. Until we run them, we don't have the data. I mean, there are averages. And once you run the data and you do A/B testing, you get a better idea as to how different audiences react to different content. And I think it's really the same approach with influencers. I'd love to see everyone listening building a program where they have 10, 20, 30 influencers, and you will find the 80-20 rule. Probably 20% are going to drive 80% of the results. Obviously, some of the most important qualitative metrics are, when they post something. For instance, if they use a discount code or an affiliate link, what sort of clicks did that generate? But then there's also the cultural side. Does the branding, when they talk about you, does it fit with the rest of their feed? And I think that at the end of the day, the engagement numbers and the clicks will represent that. So there's a number of things, but I think it really does depend on actually collaborating and doing something with them to really understand their true influence.
Yeah. Okay. So that's our one lightning round question because we ran out of time. But where do we send folks to get the book, to get the preview of the book, to follow you on social and potentially work with you as well?
Well, my name is Neal Schaffer, so nealschaffer.com. I'm Neal Schaffer everywhere on social media. I am the real Neal, so it's Neal. And there's a few Schaffers out there in social media. Mine is spelled Schaffer. And the name of my book is called The Age of Influence. You can find it on Amazon. If you go to my website, there's a preview edition that you can download. And the name of my podcast is called Maximize Your Social Influence.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Neal. This was a lot of fun, and you have great insights, great advice. So I'm sure our listeners are inspired to take some powerful next actions. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.